A good Erev Shabbos. Sometimes it's bewildering to see ourselves through the eyes of others. Sometimes it's enlightening. You'll recall Aviva Zornberg's insightfully rendering Bamidbar as bewilderments in the title of her recent book. Often we translate Bamidbar as numbers, though it more accurately means in the desert or in the wilderness. The Jewish people are more than a little bit bewildered in this book. As we make our way through the wilds, and on several occasions, we have a glimpse of ourselves through the eyes of others. In the summer of 22, the Jewish people are not in the headlines per se, although, of course, the president of Ukraine is a member of the tribe, and although the UN, for the moment, has actually weightier topics to consider than its standard list of accusations against the Jewish state, we're not in the spotlight at this very moment, Ken Ayin Hara, so it offers us a moment to reflect on how we appear through the eyes of others, now and in history. This week's Parsha, Balak, gives us a window to see a glimpse of ourselves in the perspective of others. We have the words of the prophet hired to curse Israel, the very words of Bilam himself. He says about us, Hein am levadad yishkon, behold, this Jewish people is a nation that will dwell in solitude. Uvagoyim lo yischashev. It will not be reckoned among the nations. Bilam is a non-Jew, to be sure, and a prophet just as surely. And his words are significant enough to be recorded in the Chumash. And nevertheless, it's not the prophecy that we're most concerned about. It's rather what we make of it, how we understand it, what kind of context we put. That's most important. There are any number of explanations of this notion of aloneness. Rabbi Shmuel Alter, in his commentary, Lekuter Bas Lekute, says that Bilam was struck with wonder just like we are. What is the secret of persistence of the Jewish nation? Even in those days, we didn't have a lot of friends. There was persecution, there were attacks, oppression. How do those Jews find the fortitude to endure? He wondered. Bilam saw the fact that we live apart, Am levadad yishkon, and thought maybe that's the key. He thought that since the nations of the world are bound to consider us an annoyance at best, a target for attacks at worst, uva goyim lo yischashev, we're not reckoned among them. We go and we make our own way. You see this most in regard to the state of Israel. It's the only nation on the planet where there seems to be no consensus that it even has a right to exist. In fact, our enemies still call in their charters for Israel's destruction through violent means, unique among nations of the world. Nevertheless, despite all that, Israel itself is seen as the obstacle to peace for decades, centuries even. Nations of the world have not found their way to consider us normal, like the rest of them, one of the guys. And Bilam felt, according to Rabbi Alter's explanation, that even when we are accepted, we don't assimilate because we are reckoned neither among the nations nor inside the nations. The nations themselves, deep down, they don't see us as equally valid human beings. That's one take on this idea of isolation. The second view is from the Degel Machne Ephraim, the Sudlikover Rebbe. He recorded many teachings in the name of his grandfather, his Zayda, the Baal Shem Tov, and he speaks about a slightly different viewpoint on what it means to be a nation that dwells alone. He wrote that Uvagoyim lo yischashev, we do not reckon, we do not take into account or care or worry, for that matter, about what the nations of the world think of us, because we recognize that our destiny is our own to shape. What others say or think of us is far less of consequence than what we think of ourselves. In fact, if we were to believe everything that's said about us, even if we took the time to read everything they write and say about us, we'd never get anything done. There's only so many hours in the day. The care and concern has to be centered on ourselves, rather than letting anyone else be the center of gravity, the focal point for determining our path, our course in the history of our people, and telling us who we are. A third understanding, a nice twist on this verse, is from Divrei Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer of Oldenburg, who reads an equation of sorts into the whole thing. He reads it like this: Am levadad yishkon. When we see ourselves as a nation apart from the rest of the world, then yishkon, we will dwell as a self-contained entity. I wonder if he also meant yishkon like shechina, also, that the divine presence dwells with us as well. And the other side of the equation, the other possibility, uva goyim, if we choose to live among and live like really the nations of the world, then lo yischashev, we won't be reckoned as ourselves anymore. We lose our uniqueness and our ability to use our gifts and talents, not instantly, not overnight, but rapidly in a generation or two or three at most. Each of these sheds a little light on how some Jews see themselves, and maybe that gives us a bit of insight for ourselves as well. The first understanding that we remain apart because they don't let us lead a normal life has, to me, the hint of victimization about it. We live in an age where victimhood is the coin of the realm. If you can prove you're a victim, not talking about actual victims of sexual or physical abuse, but entire classes of national groups of people for whom we're turning language and society inside out to avoid any hint or suggestion of persecution, even though we still do it. We still privilege some over the others. The victimhood stance is very seductive, very tempting, because it takes the locus of responsibility and puts it on someone else's shoulders. Look, everyone has things done to them, and the Jewish people has certainly not had it easier than any other. But it's a real trap you can fall into to define yourself as a victim and say, well, I am this way because of what other people did to me. It may even be true, but it's almost zero help in making positive change. Whatever others did to you or to your people, the only point where things turn around is when you take charge of your own destiny. Take, for example, the Hamas cause against Israel. Someone gave me a short paper to read this week, so I'm thinking about it, with absolutely spurious claims that Israel is an apartheid state. Ludicrous, as many people in this Kehillah who saw apartheid up close have told me. And yet this myth persists, and a whole culture rests on victimhood, resentment, and resistance against the enemy, against Israel. Well, how do you change that? When all you teach your kids is resist, 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 how are they ever going to learn to cooperate? Where would they even have heard the word from? It isn't very encouraging. But that goes very deep in this Palestinian mythos. Almost 70 years already, they've been painting themselves as the victims of a great injustice done to them. Their national holiday that we call Yom HaAtzmaut, they call it Nakba, the catastrophe. Oi, look what other people did to us. If you've taught that to 3 generations already, or 4 generations, that they're not responsible for their own destiny, how can you ever hope to turn it around and get them to lead their own lives? Now, Israel also recognizes its own victimhood in Yad Vashem, and Tisha B'Av also, but in Yad Vashem, and the fact that every visiting head of state, including the U.S. president this past week, has to come and reflect and lay a wreath there, as they should. It reminds them of their silence during the Holocaust. But you can hardly say that that's all there is to Israel. There's a lot more, built by people who came from Europe with numbers on their arms, and 1 million or more Jews who came from Arab lands with not much more than the shirts on their backs. They were forced to leave everything behind. And they built Israel into a superpower, economically, militarily, socially, and everything else. That's the difference between passively accepting the hand that history deals you, in contrast to assuming responsibility for your own destiny, which is really the pshat, the deeper, the simple, the meaning on the face of it, of the second explanation, that the Jews do not really reckon what the nations of the world care or think or say about us. We set our own standards. We have our own set of metrics and our own internal gyroscope of morals and directions given to us by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That seems to me to be a real determinant of success in people who strive their whole lives. Are you trying to meet the expectations of others, or are you trying to meet your own standards that you set for yourselves? That might be the deeper meaning behind the third explanation, that when we remain Am Levadad is when we merit Yishkon. Remaining true to ourselves is part of the secret of our eternity. We remain connected to the one source of life, the master of the universe. And when we live in a way that lets that neshama, that spark of godliness, show through in what we do, when we remain connected to the eternal, we remain eternal. When we don't, we don't. So based on the notion that of these notions, you have some insight into the Jewish culture wars among ourselves. How separate is separate enough? Do we have to speak a different language than everybody else? Do we have to dress differently, eat differently, marry differently, work and rest differently? Well, yes. But again, how differently does it have to be? We're all separatists of one kind or another. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you. We've all marked ourselves as different. That mezuzah on your front door, it marks you as different. When you come here on Shabbos morning, instead of all the other fun things you could do on a Saturday morning, that marks you as different. When you decline those nice theater tickets for that a friend offers you because it's Rosh Hashanah or the second Seder, that says that you're different. You don't have to wear a shtreimel to be different, to stand apart, to be outside of what society calls normal. Reminds me of the story. A chassid has to spend the weekend in some out-of-the-way place like Hamilton or something. I don't know. He'd rather be in the city with his family, but he has an all-day business meeting Friday, so he can't get home for Shabbos. He stays with a local family. And as they're about to walk out the door Friday afternoon to go to shul, this chassid appears. He's got his white socks, he's got his knee pants, his white shirt with the tzitzis hanging down to his knees, and of course a silk Shabbos coat, and he's combed and he's curled his payas so they hang just right on either side of his face. He's a real picture. So he's ready to go to shul. He meets the family at the front door, and he puts on one of those little Greek fisherman's caps. So the host says, "Yankel, is that your Shabbos hat? Where's your regular Shabbos hat? Where's your shtreimel?" Yankel says, "I didn't want to bring it. I didn't want to stand out." We're that guy. We think we can disguise it, we can hide it, we can comb it back, comb it over. Forget it. The world knows who we are. The question to us is, do we know who we are? I heard from friends in Europe where it's never been that cool to be upfront and direct with your Jewish identity, that once they did in fact identify publicly as Jews, somehow their colleagues treated them with more respect than when they were sort of hiding in the shadows there with their Jewish identity. That very topic is addressed in the next verse, following the one we're talking about so much as it happens. You see that Bilam expresses a wish that he be like us. He says, "Tamas nafshi mois yesharim," may my soul die the death of the righteous. V'atahi acharisi kamoihu, may my destiny be like his, like Yaakov's. Who's your worst enemy? Someone who envies what you are and what you have and wants to be like you. That's Bilam. Maybe that's the anti-Semite too. He looks at us and says, "Boy, I wish I had all that." And since he can't, he becomes jealous and angry and vindictive, and in the worst scenarios, violent. Now, our teacher, the late, great Lord Sachs, takes issue with this whole perspective on aloneness, separateness, isolation. He sees, you won't be surprised to hear, great value in uniqueness and difference. In fact, one of his earlier works was titled "The Dignity of Difference." And yet he sees isolation as different, as distinguished from separateness or uniqueness. Isolation is a curse, not a blessing. It's a curse. Remember, it's Bilam's words. Sachs sees that when we've been able to contribute to society, of course it's been for society's betterment at large, but also to our own benefit. In his typical optimistic, positive, hopeful outlook, Lord Sachs looks forward to a time when the uniqueness of the Jewish people is prized and valued and celebrated, not envied, erased, silenced, or exterminated. The question to us in Parshas Balak, and really it's an echo of the mistake of the spies a few weeks ago in Parshas Shalach. It's not how others feel about our Judaism. The question is, how do we feel about our Judaism, our Jewish identity, our Jewish life? How do we carry it? How proudly do we wear it? How do we live it? And how do we pass it on? That's what we have to concern ourselves the most with. And that's a possible lesson from this whole story with the non-Jewish king Balak and his prophet for hire Bilam, who sent to curse us, but in the end can only bless us. We're entering this Shabbos into the period of the 3 weeks between the 17th of Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, a time of national mourning. We actually do reflect on what has been done to us over the centuries and how much it's hurt us. We don't ignore it. But what we're getting at in living through this period of mourning is to hope and pray and work for the transformation of the world. We start with ourselves, then next with our precious Kehillah, then we transform the world into the kingdom of peace that God and we want it to be. As we enter into these subdued and sad days of Bein HaMetzarim, between Shavas Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, 3 Shabbosos from now, we pray that all the power of these days, which in the past has manifested in such negative ways, that all that power, all that potential that this time period of the year contains, should be transformed from mourning into happiness, from hurting into healing. In order for that to happen, We all have to show ourselves to be willing and eager partners in creation, not only on Shabbat, but each day of the week, and help transform God's world, our world, into its best and highest potential. Good Shabbos.